I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who's Alan Sherry. Alan is the chair of the CLD Standards Council, and during the pandemic, Alan represented CLD on the Further and Higher Education Ministerial Group and chaired the CLD Leadership Group. Alan's going to talk about the national work that was undertaken with the Scottish Government. I think he's going to focus on the opportunities for the sector post-COVID and just look at how this change will shape the CLD sector going forward. So I'd just like to hand over to Alan.
Thank you very much for inviting me along this morning to contribute to the webinar. And the first thing I would like to do is to thank you all for your work during the pandemic. I know that the CLD workforce has responded magnificently to the challenges that we faced. I know that some of you have been diverted from your key task, and I know that others of you have been working to be innovative and creative within your own roles. And there's been some marvellous examples after the Digital Fife experience, and has showcased the youth work in Dundee approach as well on a number of occasions when I've been looking for examples to demonstrate what we're doing as a sector as part of our contribution to tackling the issues that come out of the pandemic. I also like to make the point is that it's been across the CLD family that we've responded well and effectively in this crisis. It's not just been one aspect of CLD. And it's been clear that your commitment to the individuals and communities that you serve has been really welcome. This has been recognised by Richard Lockhead, who technically still is our Minister, at least until next Thursday, and by a range of other decision makers, including the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister. So again, I'd like to thank you for what you've done today and what you'll continue to do as we move to the new normal and to create what we want from the future. I've been asked this morning to provide an overview of what the Standards Council has been seeking to do, we've contributed to the Scottish Government responses to the pandemic and their efforts to influence what building back better actually means. I think I've probably got the short end of the stick here in the sense is that I've got a kind of boring policy overmap bit to do, but I think it's crucial that we highlight our importance within what this new world will be. As Marie said, I was asked to join the Ministerial Tertiary Education Working Group. That was led by Mr. Lockhead. It consisted of the higher education institutions, colleges, unions, the Funding Council, Skills Development Scotland, and clinical advisors. It focused initially when the pandemic started on the immediate problems, usually around what we were going to close down, why we were closing it down, and then secondly about resources. And that discussion was dominated by colleges and universities as both sectors advocated that the financial crisis they faced was equally telling as the position vis-a-vis the health pandemic. However, that's a challenge for us, and I'll say more about this later in the sense that it's difficult for us as a sector to put a coherent view across as to what our financial ask is because of lack of information, and I'll say a bit more about that later. One of the key things was, though, that the Minister agreed after the first meeting that as a sector, CLD would have an input to those meetings at every meeting, and there would be a slot reserved for us to raise our issues and challenges, which were different, particular, specific to our sector and what our sector was doing to support the others as we move forward. It provided an opportunity to ask the Scottish Government for details on what provision and resource of CLD was. And that was an interesting aspect, particularly working with our colleagues in the civil service within the Scottish Government, who didn't have access to that information. because it's scattered across a number of areas. And continually that gave me the opportunity to say, how can you develop policy? How can we plan if we don't know what resources are available for us to deliver services? How can you hold us accountable for delivering those services? How can we be responsible for those services? And how can you then scrutinise effectively how those services are delivered if we have no notion about the resources available to deliver? And the Minister acknowledged that, and some work now has been done within Scottish Government to identify how we get those resources and how we get some analysis and evaluation of that going forward. One of the key issues for us, I think, at that point was, and certainly in my experience, for the first time, we had engagement at a strategic level in developing guidance that for our service within the context of the government's approach to what was to happen in education generally. We were not always at the coos tail. We were not always the second thought. However, I would acknowledge that sometimes when Mr. Swinney or the First Minister was speaking, that it focused on schools, colleges and universities and not always on us. However, that wasn't the case in terms of forming policy. There is a challenge within that though, and it's a challenge that faces all of us who work within CLD, and that we need to explain what our contribution is and impact, and what our impact is, particularly to those with limited experience of what we actually do. And going forward, I would contend that one of the things that we need to consider carefully is how do we present a uniform view of the role of CLD in all parts of the CLD family, community development, adult learning, youth work, how we're integrated and how we support the major policy initiatives of the Scottish Government. Say a wee bit more about that. The other opportunity of the group was to talk about Brexit and the issues for Brexit, particularly around Erasmus. It was important that we had an opportunity with the Minister to make the point that Erasmus isn't just about colleges or universities, it's about what it means for adult learners, it is what it means for young people and working in youth work. And the Minister got that and immediately ensured that that was considered as the Scottish Government's approach to replacing whatever's going to replace Erasmus. We know that touring doesn't do it for us, and the Scottish Government has promised us another approach. So that was really important. One of the other strategic things that's going to affect our sector across the board is the Scottish Funding Council review of colleges and higher education institutions. You've probably, those of you have probably seen some of the correspondence that's kicking around, particularly in the adult learning side, around people arguing about articulation and progression from community-based learning into college or university. What we've had as an opportunity is to raise what we would want from a review of those services. We know that in some areas, colleges work in very good partnerships with CLD providers, CLD services in order to deliver community-based learning. We know in others that very little actually happens, if anything at all. And we also know that partnership working isn't particularly effective. Being on that group has given us an opportunity to make the case that, particularly with colleges, there should be greater engagement with CLD. And for my sins, I have been asked to join the Funding Council's reference group, which meets for the first time tomorrow to review what their proposals are. Maybe I shouldn't say this as we're being recorded, but when I was a college principal, I was never asked to join any Funding Council group. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to join a Funding Council group. From our role on that ministerial group, Mr. Lockhead has consistently argued that tertiary education requires to be coherent and cohesive, and that includes CLD. And from that, other bits and pieces have started to fall into place, and can we mention some of those later. In order to support that strategic group, what was agreed was we'd establish a CLD leadership group. And that, again, drew representatives from all three parts of the CLD family: adult learning, community development, and youth work, plus representatives from local authorities, Education Scotland, both the development side and the scrutiny team, and civil servants. And that gave us a forum to talk about how we could operationalise some of the strategic elements that were coming down from the ministerial group. It also gave me access to a huge raft of experience, resource, insight, and thoughtful consideration of what we need to do to go forward, and to take that back into the ministerial group. Those meetings were very well attended, had great influence on what the guidance was, and I accept that the guidance isn't everything that we'd want it to be in terms of how we reopen services, but there is a break in terms of the clinical aspect of being the final arbiter of what's important. It was, but our views were being heard, and our guidance was being published at the same time as everybody else, and I think that was really important. It also gave an opportunity to get underneath issues around resourcing, funding, provision, particularly where the gaps were and how we dealt with those gaps, if we could. And again, how we would seek to influence government strategy for reopening the economy and reopening educational services. It also considered at some length professional learning, especially around the digital ask, and raised a number of important issues about the lack of access to digital resources for yourself as the workforce, which was a key issue. Access for learners, particularly adult learners, to digital equipment, how digital poverty impinged on our ability to deliver services, and how we could upskill our workforce in order to make sure that people moved into this digital environment more easily. It was a really useful group, and it's envisaged that that group will continue as we move forward. Because we're in the state of the Purdah state just now, neither of these two groups have met for the last 4 weeks or so, but it's anticipated we'll start again after the election and we get a new minister. Equally important, Marion has represented our sector on the Learner Journey Working Group, which was a body looking at the interruption of learning, particularly for students with placement experience. And for us, as you know, that cascades both into our degree programmes, but also into the work that we do with at non-degree level at colleges. And Marion's been fighting our corner there, that our students need access to placements, that our standards that are required to be maintained in order to get professional recognition are known and observed and are not simply swept aside. It's been deemed not to be unimportant. And as you all, those of you who know Marion, which I assume most of you, will know that Marion's fought our corner brilliantly in that kind of context. So that's been part of what we're trying to do in terms of informing strategy at that level at the moment, which is not 4 or 5 years strategy. It's been more like sometimes 4 or 5 days, sometimes 4 or 5 weeks, but that's been important in terms of how we moved that on. What I thought might also be useful as we're looking to build, as we go, what the future will look like, is what's the Standards Council been doing for the last 2 years or so. I was just reflecting that it is 2 years since I was appointed chair. It's disappeared, and it's certainly not been what I envisaged being chair of the Standards Council would be like because of the pandemic. It's been difficult to be as engaged with you in the way that I would have wanted to be, simply because you can't travel anywhere, but perhaps that's coming soon. But over the last 2 years, what we've tried to do within the context of the Standards Council is have a much more active role in influencing policy. Scottish Government guidance, the types and accessibilities of CLD qualifications across Scotland, statutory framework for CLD, and scrutiny, and what that scrutiny actually is. And I know we're going to have an input on scrutiny later, but I'll say some of the things of what we've been trying to do around that. We think that that work that we started 2 years ago has become even more important as the Scottish Government seeks to work out what a post-pandemic environment will be. I think that we asked, and if we haven't circulated it, we will, and it is available on Standards Council website. But one of the things we did as a Standards Council in response to the pandemic, early in the pandemic, was write the paper, Engage, Educate, Connect, Empower, CLD Resilience and Recovery. This was intended to influence Scottish Government thinking on the key role of the CLD family in the new normal, or whatever the post-pandemic environment is going to be. It was written in July 2020, and I think at that time we thought, well, this is what we'll try and influence for October 2020. Clearly that was well off the mark. Our emphasis was on how CLD contributes across key Scottish Government policy areas and what that impact would be. So what we were trying to do there was, for non-CLD practitioners, is highlight that CLD doesn't fit into one box. That the paper picked all three aspects, highlighted what we could do within that. So we had a big section on youth work and how it could raise attainment, how it widened access, and how it worked in partnerships with schools to deliver a curriculum for excellence, and how that was key to it. We had a section on adult learning, which talked about partnership with colleges and partnerships with SDS and how we could take that forward, and a section on public health, which was around how we could deliver public health messages and how we were best placed to deliver those public health messages, rather as part of a continuum, rather than as an ad hoc response. And we felt that that paper landed well, because when we were having further discussions with both civil servants and politicians, there was a great acknowledgement that CLD didn't fit into a narrow box, and that was really, really helpful for us. Clearly, we need to go back and revise that paper in the light of circumstances, but that was very important for us. What we've also tried to do is to focus on the key role of CLD in partnership working, and on delivering outcomes which make a difference in community development and public health. Oh, sorry, that was my fault for not switching my phone off. Basically, what we focused on partnership working and how we deliver outcomes. And it is one of the challenges for our sector, in the sense is that we don't often set out our outcomes within the context of others' policy objectives. And what we've been trying to do with the Standards Council is find a means of doing that, so that ministers recognise why funding us has a huge benefit. So that's what we've been trying to do. We've been trying to join the dots for people, and I think Marion will say something similar when she speaks, but one of the key tasks that I have found in this role is people don't join the dots in a CLD service. They might vaguely know something about youth work, they might vaguely know something about adult learning, but usually a very narrow aspect of it, and they're not even sure what community development actually is. And sometimes we need to try and break all that down, join the dots and explain what we do and the importance of what we do and how it fits in. We've had some very interesting discussions around the discovery of meta skills by other aspects of the education sector and Skills Development Scotland. And what we've been arguing is the meta skills that they say are required for 21st century life and work are the skills that we deliver all the time within good CLD practice. And that's been, sometimes you felt as if you've revealed the Rosetta Stone to some people when you've explained how that actually operates within your sector. But that's been really important in terms of trying to shift people's perceptions. We were engaged with the civil service about the revised guidance for the CLD strategic plans. And what we sought to do, and hopefully you'll recognise that in the new guidance, is there's a greater emphasis on ownership of the plans, that there's a greater focus on partnership, and reinforce that unmet need couldn't be swept under the carpet. We made the point that we were aware when we reviewed plans, as did our HMI colleagues, is that unmet need rarely featured because there'd been a block on that. So we were making that point as clearly as it could not be ignored anymore. And hopefully the new guidance makes that quite clear. Time will tell if that influence has worked. However, in my view, the Minister powerfully spoke about the importance of the new guidance and set aside time in his diary to brief senior officers from local authorities, third sector and colleges about the emphasis that the government was placing on these plans and the importance of these plans. So hopefully that's a building block for us to help shape what the world should be going forward. We've had some interesting discussions with the head of post-16 scrutiny around what we think the key issues for scrutiny should be going forward. There have been really positive meetings about the nature of scrutiny and what it should be and what it should be seeking to do. And in our view, we've made the case that it should be seeking to highlight best practice. It should be supporting the CLD workforce and holding local authorities to account in the context of their statutory role. And one of the things that certainly I've been very vocal about in terms of my time at the council is that there was the disconnect between the scrutiny aspect and how local authorities dealt with that. I've made the point at virtually every fora that I've been engaged in, and every time it's been raised with the Minister, that the way where CLD sits within local authorities influences greatly the consideration given to scrutiny. So if you're within the education sector and education directorate within a local authority, there's a very obvious route. But if you're in an ALIO, third arm's length organisation, it may never flip across the council's formal structures. So we've been making that point quite clearly, and certainly the head of post-16 scrutiny sees that as a challenge and an issue and something that she certainly was going to take forward when we last spoke. What we've also been aware is the working on the nature and shape of CLD qualifications. Firstly, to make sure that they're still relevant, that they deliver the right educational background for those seeking to join our profession. We've worked hard to devise new systems of approval for our HEIs, and a new system will be rolled out soon in terms of how we're going to do that. So it's been piloted at the moment. We looked at provision for particularly HN, working with communities and the professional development awards and youth work, where they were delivered, and how many institutions and so on. And we identified a huge disparity in geographic spread. And that gives a cause for concern. So there are parts of Scotland who until relatively recently, and still are, parts of Scotland, where there are no colleges offering any of our qualifications. Some of you will know that Maggie Patterson's undertaken an excellent piece of work in that, and again, that's available on the CLD website. And since that work's been undertaken, Marion and I have been speaking to colleges, and Marion has, and perhaps we'll mention it in our own overview, has been working with colleges to increase the range of qualifications offered and where they are offered. Now, we think those are really important because we know our sector has lots of volunteer and community activists who can consider full-time employment or consider employment within our sector, but don't have access to the necessary qualifications. And for many of them, the first step would be at provision at their local college, and then to consider whether they wanted to move on to degree provision. So we're doing that, and we hope that that is important. We want to make sure that we have a qualified workforce out there, and we have many routes into being a qualified workforce. We've also been working at a level about how do we work in partnership to deliver digital upskilling and professional learning opportunities. For us, we're aware that pre-pandemic, but certainly through the pandemic, from the work that the council did in terms of surveys, is that people were willingly engaging in digital, but lacked the confidence that they had the skills necessary to do it. So we set up some partnership working with colleges, College Development Network, and you had access to those. But one of the discussions that we're having is, how do we do that on a systemic basis? How do we have a national approach to professional learning? How do we resource a national approach to professional learning? And how do we ensure, like as other professionals working in the education sector, that you have access to that, allowed access to that by your employer if you work in a local authority or if you work in the third sector. So that then fits in with the notion of where we are with the registration. In terms of our broader ambitions, certainly one of the things that was an aspiration of the council, and we were glad to see it in the programme for government, was the commitment to a lifelong learning framework, which will include the adult learning strategy and the youth work strategy, and the importance of the collective CLD family when arguing for resources. We think that kind of framework will give us an opportunity to have a different type of conversation with ministers, civil servants, and with local authorities as we push that forward. We are trying to get across to funders and decision makers that all three aspects of CLD are interrelated, and learners move across them. You're not always a young person in a youth work, you're not always an adult learner, and community-based adult learning, and community development can be a bit of the middle in the Venn diagram of all those. We criticise others for working in silos and ignoring us, but sometimes we work in silos ourselves, and we need to try and break out of that. One of our broader ambitions has to be to talk about CLD and then aspects of CLD as we go forward. I think that's key if we are to shape the world that we want in the way that we would like to. We're also trying to strengthen the CLD regulations to ensure that there's less of a wriggle room for local authorities and others not to deliver our services and to pretend that they don't have a statutory duty to do it. Sorry, I shouldn't use the word pretend. Avoid the fact that they have a statutory duty to do it. And I know I've got 2 minutes, Gwen, I'm nearly finished. We're arguing for securing greater resources at a time of budgetary constraints, and we'll fight dirty on that. And we want to build sustainability into funding and resourcing rather than an initiative-based funding, because we're conscious that that's a big issue. And finally, what we're arguing is you can't create a fairer Scotland without CLD. And I'm sorry I've overrun, I apologise. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. That was really helpful and great to set a tone, because I think more than anything, you know, while we've been going through what we've been going through and what's been happening in communities, it's been really, really important that we've had that voice at that strategic and national table, because, you know, there are big ticket items, obviously, in terms of learning loss and in further education, and it would have been easy for CLD just to have disappeared off the radar in that whole dialogue. So it's been really important that we've been at that table, that we've had that voice, and particularly working on guidance for us to restart provision. I know, speaking from somebody with a lead role in a local authority, if we hadn't have had that national guidance, we wouldn't be restarting. So it's been really, really valuable, but I think this is about how do we move forward and what is our role. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for questions. You can either do hands up, or if you want, put a question in the chat. So I'll just open it up and see if anyone's got any points or questions that they want to make for Alan. I'm not actually seeing any hands up. Oh, I do. I see Ross. Do you want to just unmute and put your camera on?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. Thanks, Alan, for that input, and also thanks to you and the Standards Council for the efforts last year to drive forward the CLD agenda. The question, I suppose, is going to be a bit long-winded, as people would expect it to be, but last week we heard quite strongly about this need for a revision of the social values around about caring, kindness, friendship, and community. And then this morning we've heard from you around about the opportunities, I guess, that have been presented to the sector to talk about our professional approach and where we can contribute effectively how communities rebuild and refocus. And again, thinking that through, that's perhaps around about our professional values and ethics, about community, about equity, about social justice. And all of that's, as you outlined, had been in discussion with Scottish Government. So I guess I'm interested in what commitment longer term there is from Scottish Government sector. What does that commitment look like? But also, what's the involvement of COSLA, or the likelihood of greater involvement from COSLA in building that same level of commitment? Because from a local authority perspective, whilst government can produce policy and direction, how that is then translated and used within a local authority context, who are the funders and deliverers of CLD activity locally, it's often a bit of tension or barriers to be removed before all of that happens. So it's really around about that commitment for the sector from a Scottish Government perspective and how we build that momentum with COSLA at the same time.
I think that's what we've focused on at the moment has been engaging with ministers, because the view was that we had to get Scottish Government buy-in. There are some really good examples of local authorities who engage in the way that you've outlined, Ross, but it's not systemic. And what we were trying to do was to create a notion that there had to be systemic approach to that. And we think the new statutory guidance is part of the way of doing that. We also think that scrutiny is part of the way of doing that. What we're hoping is that with the new minister, with the impetus that the lifelong learning framework will give us and the adult learning strategy and the new youth work strategy, we can then engage with COSLA on a different footing. Marion has already good links in with COSLA around in a number of areas, and we've had buy-in from COSLA, and you'll probably seen in the newsletter across the board. But we need to create an environment where officers, senior officers within local authorities recognise that they have the same obligations and the same duties to deliver for our sector as they do for schools in early years. And that's a bit of a shift. And part of it is, as I said, is where it sits. But I spent virtually all my working life in Glasgow. CLD in Glasgow sits in Glasgow Life, which is an arm's length organisation. Whereas CLD in other local authority areas sits within the Education Directorate and there's more obvious ways of getting to politicians. So we have to work on that, and we have to hope that, well, if we can get ministers to buy into it, ministers control funding, and it's hard to ignore what a minister tells you to do. And if we can get the scrutiny aspect right, and that's one of the key issues, is making sure that local authorities can't ignore what HMI are saying about scrutiny, whether it's very, very positive or about the failure to meet unmet needs or to deliver effectively across the CLD family. How do you consider systemic approaches with diverse and multifaceted communities? I think there's two reasons. The sense is like, I'm a great believer in that you need a framework which is not prescriptive. but allows accountability and responsibility. It enables people within that to meet the needs of their community. So, for example, the answers for Ayrshire or Aberdeenshire in terms of how you deliver CLD, I would imagine, will be greatly different from the communities that I used to work in Glasgow or the community that I live in North Lanarkshire. But there should be a systemic framework, which means that I, you, HMI, ministers can then say to that local authority, we required you to consider the following. What have you done and how have you prioritised within that? So, for example, have you prioritised dealing with your proportion of the 400,000 adults that have few or no qualifications who are likely to be unemployed because in your community with your demography, that's a big problem? Or have you just ignored that because you put all your resource into, I don't know, something else? So it's about how you create that framework. Good CPPs do that. Good community planning partnerships have blue sky objectives, and then they ask, how are you going to deliver on those blue sky objectives? It's not to be prescriptive, but it's to give you an underpinning and a system. Hopefully that's an answer, Alan.
Thanks. It was quite a complex question, isn't it? I'm just trying to look in the hands up or the chat to see if anybody else has got any more questions. Is there any other points people want to make before we move on to the next speaker? No, right. Thank you. It is complex, Alan, and I think, you know, the point Ross makes about engaging with COSLA and others are ones that we'll need to take on board going forward. And I know there's been a lot of information come out around the Social Justice and Renewal Board and the role that CLD has in that in terms of community empowerment. So I think for me, the big thing is making sure that our voice is at the table going forward, and that we've got representation on those groups through the Standards Council and other bodies.
I think one of the things that we should not lose now is the role that we have at that level. And I think if there's any attempt to exclude us going forward, that we should tackle that full on. And that's key. Now that we're at the table, we should not lose our place there. And that will help us continue. Anyway, I know I've spoken for far too long, and I apologise, but thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak to you this morning. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome, and thanks for your contribution.